right, geometry. We're going to try and get through as much of this as possible. So we're actually going to go through the first 6 postulates here. So any notes that you want to add to your booklet, you can go ahead and do so, or you can just take your notes on the paper that I give you in class. But either way, we need to make sure we know these postulates or how to use them, okay? So for the first 3 terms, we've been working with definitions, and that's just a statement of the meaning of a term, okay? So the definition of an obtuse angle is any angle that is greater than 90, less than 180, that kind of thing. Now the postulates that we're talking about, these are all true statements that do not have to be proven, okay? So a true statement that does not have to be proven. And then eventually we're going to talk about theorems, which are statements that have been proven to be true, okay? So for our first postulate, the segment addition postulate, it's exactly what it sounds like, okay? The segment addition is talking about adding parts of a segment together, okay? Segment addition. So in our example here, I have AE. So the given, we have to make our conclusion from the given. So the given is AE congruent to FD. So those two are equal. And then it also says EB is congruent to CF. So if that is true, what we can do is add those 2 parts together. So if we do that, add them together, I'm going to get the whole segment, AB congruent to CD. Okay, and that's my conclusion. The whole thing, so the whole thing is congruent to the whole thing. So in our case, it would be AB is congruent to CD. So we just added the 2 parts together to get the whole thing. That's the segment addition postulate. Okay, so on the same line, we're talking about now angles. Okay, so if we're talking about angles, again, it's angle addition. So I'm going to take one angle, add it to another, right? So in this case, our given, it says GHJ. So this angle here. Again, you always want to try and label as much as possible. Okay, so GHJ is right here, congruent to NMK. So those 2 are congruent. And then on the same part, GHI, so GHI is right there, congruent to LMK. Okay, so if those 2 parts are congruent, if these 2 parts are congruent, then I can get the whole thing congruent as well. Okay, so if you look at what that would be, the whole thing would be GHI congruent to NML. NML. Put the 2 together. Okay, so that's our conclusion. Angle GHI is congruent to angle NML. Angle addition, because we added the 2 together. Okay, so on the next one, now we're talking about subtraction. Okay, so we're probably going to have the whole thing, and we want to go ahead and find what's left. Okay, so angle subtraction postulate, we have the given is GHI, so the whole thing here, oops, I'm going to go ahead and use a highlighter again. So the GHI is the whole thing, congruent to NML, the whole thing over here. Okay, and then it also tells us that JHI, so that's just this little part right here, and LMK, so just this little part here. Okay, so the subtraction postulate tells us that if I have the whole thing congruent and then a part congruent, then we can just kind of take off what's left over. So take off what they both have, and then what we have left is also congruent. Okay, so that would mean the other part in this case is GHJ and NMK. So that's our conclusion. Angle GHJ is congruent to angle NMK. That's angle subtraction postulate, because we subtracted off one part. So in this case, we subtracted this part off and gave what's left. Okay? So the last part, same exact deal. Segment subtraction, we're going to have the whole segment and then take off the part that we are given. So in this case, it says AE is congruent to FD. And then we also have the fact that AB, so the whole thing here, is congruent to CD. So if we know that information, then all we have to do is say, okay, we'll take this part off and what's left over. So what's left over would be EB and CF. So those two parts are congruent. So EB is congruent to CF for our conclusion. Okay? Segment subtraction. All right? So now let's go ahead to go to the next part and just do the top two here. These are our halves postulate. Okay, so we've talked about midpoint a lot and bisectors, and what they do is split things in half into two congruent parts. So for segment halves postulate, here's our givens. I have PS congruent to AT, so PS is this whole thing, and then I have AT is this whole thing. So if those two are congruent, then aren't their parts going to be congruent? So what we have here is for our PS one, we have M is the midpoint of PS. So if M is the midpoint here, that means that these two parts are congruent to each other. And then if N is the midpoint of AT, then those two parts are congruent. Well, we already said that the two segments as a whole are congruent. So if they're congruent and they both have a midpoint, then all of their parts are also congruent. So I can say, for instance, PM is congruent to AN, or I could also say PM is congruent to NT. Okay? Because they're all the same part. They're all the same length. But what I could also say is MS. So MS is congruent to both as well. AN or MS is congruent to NT. Okay? And that's by the halves postulate. All right? So, same thing for the angle. Okay, so let's look at the angles here. Angles halves postulate. So first of all, let's look at the last given here. It says PCT and XYZ. So PCT is this whole thing, right? And XYZ is this whole thing. Okay? So what we have now is that YK, so right here, YK, is a bisector of XYZ. So bisecting means this part of the angle and this part of the angle are congruent. And the same for the other angle. If I have CM right here as the bisector, then those two parts are congruent. So these two are congruent. Okay? So again, the fact that these two angles as a whole are both congruent makes their parts, their halves, congruent. Hence halves postulate. So what I can say here is, like for instance, this top one, XYK. XYK is congruent to angle PCM. Or I could say angle XYK is congruent to angle MCT. So this one here, MCT. Or let's look at KYZ here. So KYZ is congruent to the top one, angle PCM. Or angle KYZ is congruent to the bottom one, MCT, angle MCT. Okay? So, again, you'll have to get a little practice with this stuff, but that's kind of our first 6 postulates. So on the homework worksheet, I'll tell you which ones to do specifically that practices these 6 postulates. Okay? So good luck. Let me know if you have questions. Peace.